Hey guys, my name's Paul Bloyd. I'm an independent filmmaker and screenwriter from Southeast Texas. No, you have not heard of me or seen any of my work, so do not bother racking your brain for memories that are not there. It's okay. It's actually been quite a while since I worked on any physical production. I worked on writing, but haven't actually been on set anything for quite some time, but lately I've started to feel that itch. If you're an independent filmmaker, you know that itch, you know what I'm talking about. But unfortunately, our world being what it is right now, scratching that itch is easier said than done. I've mostly, like I said, over the last several years considered myself a writer. And the plan was always that I would get out to LA, I would beat those streets, I would shake those hands, get those meetings, and sell those screenplays. But it never really worked out that way for me. I started thinking as I started feeling that itch, that whether I'm in Texas or if I was in LA, either way, I wouldn't be getting those meetings. If you're already there, I guess you might have some connections, and I'm sure people are on Skype and Zoom meetings as we speak, but they're not beating the streets and they're not shaking those hands. We're all kind of in the same boat. So I thought, since I'm in Texas, why not make the most of it? Let's do something different. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stare directly into that camera and I'm going to read my work to you. Now, there are three things that can happen as a result of that. One is, hopefully, it'll help me scratch that itch. Two, I might entertain a few people. And three, if I'm lucky, the right person might see it. And if you happen to be the right person, my contact information is in the description below. Hit me up. Now, Paul, you might ask, aren't you worried that if you put your work out on the internet, then people will steal it? Well, frankly, no, I'm not. For one thing, by putting it on YouTube, I'm basically putting a time and date stamp on there, which is about as close to proof of authorship as I'm going to get. And two, considering the amount of the budget that goes to the screenwriter, I've got to think it would be easier to pay me than to try to steal from me. Well, Paul, you bring up a good point. But aren't you afraid that if you put your work out on the internet, then who's going to want to buy that movie from you? Everyone's already seen it or heard it. Well, that's true. But the fact is, nobody really buys screenplays anymore. If you've seen a movie that you've liked in a theater or on Netflix or Prime or anywhere like that for the last 20 years, chances are that screenplay wasn't purchased, it was contracted. They saw that writer and they said, hey, I like what that guy wrote or that lady wrote. I wonder if I could hire them to write my movie. And if you're thinking about that about me, the answer is yes, you can. Again, see below. My screenplays are all for sale, and so am I. Now, on this channel, you're going to see and hear a number of different types of media that I have attempted over the years. You're going to hear prose. You're going to hear short film scripts. You're going to hear full-length film scripts. You're going to hear television pilots. And you might even hear a few comic book scripts. That's right. You name it, I have managed to not make a living writing it for over 20 years. But hopefully this will change today. I'm going to start off by reading you a piece of prose, something I wrote a while back called Outside of My Window. The idea for this was that it would just be voiceover narration. I call it prose, but really it's all meant to be spoken out loud, while visuals that help tell that story are shown on screen with a little bit of music in the background. So you're not going to be missing much by just hearing me read it. That's really the intent, is the words that are being spoken anyway. I had done something similar to this in a project with a buddy of mine sometime before I wrote this for a contest in which we just read a short story out loud with music playing in the background. We really liked the end result, but per the parameters of the contest, it wasn't an original short story, and we did not have the rights to it. Same thing with the music. It was music that we had found that we really liked and thought fitted, but we did not have the rights to that music. So once the contest was over, we had something we liked, but we couldn't do anything with. So the idea was this short story was that we would have something that we could use that was ours, that we can actually use once a contest was over or in any other way that we saw fit. Unfortunately, I never got around to it. Not long after this, I did end up directing my first and only full-length feature. That drained me both financially and mentally, and since then I primarily worked on just screenwriting and occasionally doing an acting gig for fun that you also haven't seen. But without further ado, my return with Outside of My Window. Lightning flashed and thunder crashed, and there was a guy sitting outside of my window. You can imagine this was somewhat frightening. At first I jumped back, tumbling out of bed, and I just sat on the floor for what felt like a good long while, rationalizing as grown men have a tendency to do, tricks of the light and all that nonsense. By the time I got back up and made my way to the window, I was pretty sure he wasn't going to be there. He was a middle-aged man with unkempt hair and a few days' growth on his chin. His clothes, a bit dirty and wet with rain, weren't quite right. It seemed less that they were out of style than they hadn't come in just yet. And he was watching me. Not in any menacing kind of way. He was just watching me. Sadly. Of course, none of this occurred to me until much later. At the moment, I was too busy calling 911 back on the other end of my bed. He was still there when the police arrived. He didn't seem interested in putting up a fight. He just watched me as they put him in the car and drove away. I tried very hard to pretend it never happened. The next day was very normal. I am, after all, a very normal guy. I'm probably the most normal age that a man in America can be. I have very normal looks, a very normal job, very normal intelligence, and a very normal lack of a love life. I felt it was normal that I didn't tell my very normal friends about the last night's events. I found myself using the word normal in very unnormal ways. Weird things will do that to you. You spend your entire life wishing for something different just to spend the rest of your life trying to convince yourself of your normality once something different actually does happen. It wasn't that weird after all. It was just a peeping Tom. But it didn't feel like a peeping Tom. Peeping Toms peep. This guy was watching. There's a difference. I might have been able to rationalize this had it not happened again that night. It was a woman this time, about the same age with equally unkempt hair and the same style of dated yet undated clothes. I was no braver this time. In fact, I believe I was more afraid. When the police arrived, it took all of my courage to leave the safety of the side of my bed. Wiping my eyes, I gave a brief statement, but I never left the house. I could only assume she watched sadly as she was placed in the car and driven away. I didn't leave the house the next day, or the day after for that matter. On the third day, I think I went into denial. I had been silly. Coincidence. That's all. I got off the floor on the side of my bed at about 1 in the morning and had a good long laugh at myself. I made a point of walking up to every window in my house, avoided now for more than 2 days, and looking out in defiance. I then showered, shaved, and when it got late enough, decided to go out of the house. The mall seemed the most crowded place, and thus the most obvious place to prove my normality. That's where I discovered that denial and defiance were not the same as true belief. There were lots of normal people there, the mall being a very normal place to be. There were children, teenagers, young couples, parents, and grandparents. But at about every other store, there seemed to be a middle-aged person with unkempt hair, wearing clothes that weren't quite right, that had yet to make it into style. And they all seemed to be watching me, sadly. Why were these people watching me? Normal me. What had I done to catch their interest? I've never considered myself to be an overly imaginative person, but I must admit that by this point I had let my imagination get the best of me. Perhaps they were aliens, unable to grasp the subtleties of human mannerisms and fashions, come down to view the representation of all that is normal. Silly, I know, but I was near delirious. My second memorable idea was far more frightening and, at least for me, far more obvious. Perhaps they had come from my future. A future where something horrible had happened to me, or where I had done something horrible. Perhaps they had come to see the man responsible, who would steal their hope, who would kill their love, who would end it all. I went home. I didn't want to think about it anymore. It got late, it got dark, and it started to rain. I went to bed. Lightning flashes and thunder crashes, and there's a guy standing outside of my window. I'm not afraid. I won't call the police. I won't even get up. I'm just going to close my eyes and try very hard to pretend he isn't there. The end. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, like, subscribe, whatever. This channel's not monetized, so it doesn't really matter all that much. But if you liked what you heard, stick around. There'll be more. And I hope to see you guys again soon. Have a good one.